You said yes again. You already knew before the words were out of your mouth that you meant no. You felt the no sitting in your chest like something solid and true. And then you heard yourself say yes, and watched the other person's face relax into relief and gratitude, and told yourself that this is what good people do. They show up, they help, they do not make things difficult. And then you drove home, or you hung up the phone, or you closed the email, and you sat with the particular weight of a person who has once again given away something they needed to keep. This has been happening for decades, not because you are weak, not because you lack intelligence or self-awareness or the ability to see exactly what is occurring, but because somewhere along the way, in childhood, in early relationships, in the slow accumulation of moments where saying no felt more dangerous than saying yes, you learned something that was never true. You learned that your needs are negotiable and other people's needs are not. And the guilt you feel every time you try to draw a line, that guilt is not your conscience speaking. That is the lie speaking. And the Stoics, 2,000 years ago, from inside circumstances far more difficult than yours, found a way to silence it permanently. Stay with me. If you are someone who has spent too long saying yes when you meant no, and is finally ready to change that without losing yourself in the guilt that follows, subscribe to this channel. Every week we go deep into Stoic wisdom through real stories that help you build the inner strength to live on your own terms. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Let's begin. 1. The yes that costs everything. Imagine a woman named Barbara. She is 54 years old, a retired school administrator in Columbus, Ohio, who spent 31 years managing the needs of students, parents, teachers, and district officials with a competence and patience that became, over time, the thing everyone around her simply assumed would always be there. She was the person people called when something was broken. She was the person who stayed late, who answered on weekends, who absorbed the anxiety of every crisis and returned it as calm. She was exceptional at this, and then she retired and discovered, with a shock she was not prepared for, that retirement had not changed the job. It had just changed the employer. Now it is her adult daughter who calls in crisis, her son-in-law who needs advice, her elderly neighbor who needs a ride to appointments 3 times a week, her sister who has been in the middle of a divorce for 2 years and processes it exclusively through 90-minute phone calls that arrive without warning and end without resolution. Barbara has been retired for 14 months. She is more exhausted than she was when she was working. And the cruelest part, the part that keeps her awake at night, is the guilt. Not about saying yes. She says yes every time. The guilt comes when she imagines saying no, when she rehearses the conversation in her head, where she tells her sister she cannot talk tonight, or tells her neighbor she needs to find another solution for Tuesdays, or tells her daughter that she needs to stop being the first call every time something goes wrong. She rehearses it, and then she feels the guilt arrive, hot, immediate, specific, and she puts the no away and picks up the phone. The guilt is doing its job perfectly. Now let us travel back to ancient Rome, to a man who understood from the inside of one of history's most demanding positions exactly what Barbara is carrying. Marcus Aurelius did not choose to be emperor. He was adopted into the position by Hadrian, then by Antoninus Pius, and spent most of his adult life trying to be adequate to a role that demanded everything and acknowledged nothing. He governed, he campaigned, he adjudicated, he received petitions and managed crises and absorbed the weight of an empire's needs with a steadiness that everyone around him depended on and almost no one ever acknowledged. And he wrote alone, by lamplight, in words meant only for himself. It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live. Read that carefully. He was not writing about physical death. He was writing about the slow, quiet, almost imperceptible death of a life spent entirely in service to what others require, with nothing reserved for what you actually need. He was writing about Barbara. He was writing about you. And Epictetus, who had spent years as a slave, whose entire existence had been legally defined as being in service to someone else's needs, wrote something that reframes the guilt entirely. Never say about anything that I have lost it, but that I have returned it. Now apply that to Barbara's situation. Every yes Barbara gives when she means no, every hour of her retirement, every unit of her restored energy, every morning that was supposed to belong to her, she is not giving. She is losing. She is returning something she earned and never gets back. The guilt she feels when she imagines saying no is protecting the wrong person. It is not protecting her relationship with her sister. Her sister will survive a conversation that ends at 60 minutes instead of 90. It is not protecting her daughter. Her daughter will develop her own resources if Barbara stops being the path of least resistance. The guilt is protecting the arrangement, the old agreement that was never spoken but has been running Barbara's life for decades. The agreement that says your needs come last. Barbara eventually did something small that felt enormous. She did not have a speech. She did not issue an ultimatum. She did not sit anyone down for a difficult conversation about her needs. She simply, the next time her sister called, answered, listened for 30 minutes and then said, "I need to go now, I love you. We will talk soon," and hung up. Her sister called back. Barbara did not answer. Her sister sent a message asking if everything was okay. Barbara replied, "Everything is fine, talk soon," and sat inside the guilt for the rest of the evening, not acting on it, not calling back, not undoing the things she had done, just sitting with it, and discovering, slowly, across the hours of that evening, that the guilt, which she had always assumed would be unbearable, was bearable, uncomfortable, but entirely bearable. And the next morning, when she woke up and the conversation with her sister was over and done and the sky had not fallen, she felt something she had not felt on a weekday morning in 14 months, like the day belonged to her. Here is the first principle. The guilt you feel when you draw a line is not evidence that the line is wrong. It is evidence that the line is new. Guilt is the feeling of a boundary being enforced for the first time in a system that was built around its absence. It will pass, not immediately, not without discomfort, but it will pass. And what remains on the other side of it is something no amount of saying yes has ever given you: your own life, back in your own hands. 2. Why good people feel the guilt most. Now meet a man named Gerald. He is 58 years old, a family physician in a mid-sized city in North Carolina who has spent 26 years in a profession that selects, almost by design, for people who are constitutionally inclined to put others first. Gerald is not just good at his job, he is the kind of doctor patients drive 40 minutes to see because they know, in a way they cannot fully articulate, that he is actually present when they are in the room with him. He listens, he remembers, he follows up. He carries his patients' stories in a way that most physicians stopped doing decades ago because the system does not reward it and the heart cannot sustain it indefinitely. Gerald has sustained it for 26 years, at a cost he has never fully calculated, because the same qualities that make Gerald exceptional at his job, the deep empathy, the instinct toward care, the inability to look at someone in need and feel nothing, are the exact qualities that make drawing a line feel like a betrayal of who he is. When his office manager suggests he reduce his patient panel to protect his own well-being, Gerald feels it as a failure of his vocation. When his wife asks him to stop taking calls during dinner, Gerald feels it as a failure of his responsibility. When his own body, through fatigue and persistent headaches and a shortness of temper that is new and unwelcome, tells him that the arrangement is unsustainable, Gerald overrides the signal and calls it weakness. He is the last person in every room he enters to receive his own care, and he has been in this pattern so long that it does not feel like a choice anymore, it feels like character. Here is what the Stoics understood about people like Gerald, that Gerald has never been told directly. The guilt you feel when you consider your own needs is not a sign of your goodness. It is a sign of a belief you absorbed so early and so completely that it now masquerades as identity. The belief that care is infinite, that a good person does not have limits, that drawing a line is the same thing as abandoning the person on the other side of it. None of that is true. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius in one of his most personal letters, "Vindica te tibi," reclaim yourself, not for your patients, not for your family, not for the version of yourself that medicine shaped and that you have been faithfully performing for 26 years, for yourself. And then he added something that Gerald needed to hear with the specificity of a prescription. Omnia aliena sunt, tempus tantum nostrum est. Everything else belongs to others. Time alone is ours. Gerald had been giving his time, his finite, irreplaceable, non-renewable time, as though it were a resource that could be replenished if he just rested enough on the weekends. It cannot. Every hour given beyond what Gerald genuinely chose to give, given out of guilt or obligation or the terror of being seen as someone who does not care enough, was an hour he was not getting back. Now let us go to ancient Greece, to Athens, and to a man whose entire life was an experiment in knowing exactly what he owed to others and what he owed to himself. Socrates was not an easy person to be close to. He asked uncomfortable questions. He refused to perform the social courtesies that smoothed interactions between people who preferred comfortable agreement to honest examination. He was accused ultimately of corrupting the youth, not because he had harmed anyone, but because he had taught people to question things that the city of Athens had decided should not be questioned. And when given the opportunity to simply stop, to agree to be less than he was, to accept a smaller version of himself that the city could accommodate without discomfort, he refused. Not with anger, not with a speech designed to win applause. With the quiet, absolute clarity of a man who had decided long before the trial what he was and what he was not willing to return, he said to the jury, in words that Plato recorded and that have survived 2,500 years, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Apply that to Gerald. The unexamined agreement, the one that says your needs come last, that your limits are a failure of character, that drawing a line makes you someone other than the good person you have spent your life being, that agreement has never been examined. It was handed to Gerald before he was old enough to question it, by a culture that celebrates self-sacrifice, by a profession that requires it, by a personality that made it feel natural. But natural is not the same as right. Gerald eventually made one change, not a dramatic overhaul of his practice or his personality. He blocked Tuesday evenings completely. No calls, no charts, no messages, just Tuesday evenings, belonging entirely to Gerald. The first Tuesday, he sat in the silence of an evening that was not organized around someone else's needs. He did not know what to do with it. He sat in his backyard and watched the light change and felt, he described it later as feeling like a person who had been slightly underwater for years and had just, without announcement, broken the surface. He could breathe. Not because the work was less important, not because the patients mattered less, but because a person who breathes is more capable of helping people than a person who is slowly drowning while pretending they are fine. Here is the second principle. The guilt you feel when you protect your own time and energy is not evidence of your goodness. It is evidence of a belief that was given to you before you were old enough to examine it. Examine it now. Ask, is it actually true that drawing this line makes me a less caring person? Or is it possible, is it not just possible, but probable, that a person who has reclaimed enough of themselves to be genuinely present is more valuable to the people they love than a person who is giving from an account that ran to 0 years ago? Reclaim yourself, not as an act of selfishness, as an act of sustainability. The people who need you will be better served by a version of you that still has something to give. 3. The line that does not need an apology. Imagine a woman named Evelyn. She is 62 years old, a recently retired human resources director from a manufacturing company in Michigan, who spent 34 years professionally mediating the space between what people wanted and what the organization could provide. She is, by training and by temperament, a person who finds the middle ground, who softens the hard edge of a difficult message, who frames the no as a redirect, who has spent 3 decades making unwelcome information land as gently as possible. She is exceptional at this, And it has cost her something she did not notice losing until it was mostly gone. Her own voice. Not her speaking voice, her actual voice. The one that knows what she thinks without running it first through the filter of how it will be received. The one that can say no without building an architecture of explanation and softening and preemptive reassurance around it. Evelyn's lines always come with essays. When she tells her adult son she cannot lend him money again, she spends 40 minutes on the phone explaining her reasoning, validating his frustration, offering alternative suggestions and apologizing for the limitations of her retirement income. When she tells her neighbor she cannot watch her dog this weekend, she provides a 3-paragraph explanation of her prior commitments and expresses genuine regret and offers to help find an alternative. When she tells her book club she cannot host this month, she sends a message so thoroughly padded with apology and explanation that the actual information, "I cannot do it," is buried somewhere in the middle. She has never simply said no. She has always said no, and here is why, and I am sorry, and I hope you understand, and please do not think less of me. And the exhaustion of that, of every single line requiring an essay to justify its existence, is part of what is draining her. Now let us travel to ancient Rome, not to the Senate chamber this time, not to a military campaign, to a moment in a corridor, a conversation between two powerful men, and to the one thing that Cato the Younger said that stopped the room cold. Cato had been asked by a colleague who had a personal stake in the answer to soften a position he had already stated clearly. The colleague was not being cruel. He was being what colleagues in power structures always are, practical. He was asking Cato to find the middle ground, to frame the no as a redirect. Cato looked at him for a moment and then said, in words that Julius Caesar reportedly heard about and found more unsettling than any of Cato's political positions, nothing. He simply repeated the position he had already stated, without the softening, without the essay, without the preemptive reassurance that the colleague's feelings were valid and his perspective was understood and the decision was not personal. The position was the position. That was the entirety of the communication. And the colleague stood in the silence of a man who had just discovered something disorienting. That Cato's no was not the beginning of a negotiation. It was the end of one. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in the spare language of a man who had learned to say exactly what he meant and nothing more, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." Apply that to Evelyn, the 40-minute phone call explaining why she cannot lend her son money again. How much of that is true? How much of it is what she actually thinks? And how much of it is the essay she built around the no to make the no acceptable to him and to herself? Evelyn made a change that felt so stark, it took her 3 weeks to practice before she could do it in a real conversation. She stopped explaining, not coldly, not abruptly, but she stopped building the essay. When her son called about money, she said, "I am not able to do that. I love you." And then she let the silence be what it was. When her neighbor asked about the dog, she said, "This weekend does not work for me. Full stop." When the book club asked about hosting, she sent a message that said, "I cannot host this month. Happy to come as a guest." No essay, no apology architecture, no preemptive reassurance, just the information. And what happened was not what she feared. Her son was briefly disappointed and then moved on to solving his problem another way. Her neighbor found another solution without apparent difficulty. The book club rearranged without drama. The relationships did not collapse. They absorbed a clear no the same way they had always absorbed her elaborate ones, except this time, Evelyn did not spend the rest of the day inside the guilt of the essay she had been forced to write. She spent it inside the unfamiliar, slightly disorienting, quietly extraordinary feeling of a woman who had said what she meant. Once, clearly, without apology. Here is the third principle. A boundary that requires an essay to justify its existence is still a negotiation. A boundary that is simply stated, clearly, once, without the architecture of preemptive apology, is a fact. You're not required to explain yourself to people whose comfort you are no longer willing to purchase at the cost of your own. Say the thing, once, clearly, and then let the silence do the rest. 4. What they actually respect. Now meet a man named Howard. He is 56 years old, a high school football coach in a small town in Texas who has spent 22 years shaping young men in the particular way that good coaches do. Not just teaching them the game, but teaching them something about themselves through the game. Howard is beloved. Genuinely, specifically, durably beloved. By former players who return years later to tell him what the work meant. By parents who trusted him with their sons at their most unformed. By a community that has watched him build something real from seasons of difficulty and occasional triumph. And Howard has a problem that none of those former players would recognize in the man they remember. He cannot say no to his mother. He is 56 years old. He has coached hundreds of young men through some of their hardest moments. He is the person people in his town call when something is genuinely difficult. And his mother, 81 years old, sharp-minded, and in possession of a particular skill for making Howard feel, in a single sentence, like he is 14 and perpetually inadequate, still runs him. Not through cruelty, through need. She calls 3 times a day. She requires his presence at Sunday dinner without asking whether Sunday works. She comments on his weight, his career, his long-ago divorce, and the general inadequacy of his life choices in the tone of a woman who believes she is simply being honest. And Howard, who would have a very direct conversation with any parent who spoke to one of his players the way his mother speaks to him, says nothing. He absorbs it. He shows up on Sunday. He answers on the 3rd call, because she is his mother, because she is 81, because the guilt of doing otherwise, of saying to his own mother, the woman who raised him, the woman who will not be here forever, anything that looks like a limit, that guilt is so large and so specifically shaped that Howard has never once looked at it directly. He drives around it every week. Epictetus wrote something that Howard needs to hear, and that most people in Howard's position have never been told directly. He is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has. But it is the deeper implication that matters here. Howard is grieving, in advance, preemptively, continuously, the loss of a mother he has not yet lost. He is paying the emotional cost of her eventual absence by making himself smaller in her presence now. By absorbing treatment he would not accept from anyone else. By confusing the genuine love he has for her with an obligation to have no limits with her. Those are not the same thing. And Marcus Aurelius, who lost his own father before he could know him, and was raised by a grandfather and then by an emperor, and carried a complexity of parental relationships that most people never navigate, wrote something in his meditations that reframes the entire question of love and limits. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. A good son is not a son without limits. A good son is a son who shows up, genuinely presently, with actual capacity to give rather than the hollow performance of it, and who maintains enough of himself to make that showing up real rather than obligatory. Howard made a change that his mother noticed immediately and did not like. He stopped answering every call. He answered once a day, at a time he chose, for a duration he decided. He still showed up on Sundays. He still loved his mother. He still sat at her table and ate her food and listened to her stories. But he stopped being available on her terms at every hour of every day. His mother expressed her displeasure, clearly and specifically. Howard sat inside that displeasure without rushing to resolve it. And something unexpected happened across the following weeks. His mother, who had never had to adjust to Howard's limits because Howard had never enforced any, adjusted, not perfectly, not without occasional return to the old pattern, but the relationship found a new level, one that Howard had set, one that reflected what he could genuinely give, rather than what guilt had always extracted. And the love between them, which had always been real, became, in the strange alchemy of honest limits, somehow more real, because Howard was present now as a choice rather than as a habit of guilt, and a presence that is chosen is always more meaningful than one that is simply compelled. Here is the 4th principle. The people who matter most to you will not love you less for having limits. They will love the version of you that has them more than the version that didn't, because the version that has limits is present by choice, and a presence chosen is always worth more than a presence extracted. Set the limit, hold it. Let the relationship find its new level. What you find there will surprise you. 5. The guilt that finally goes quiet. Finally, there is a woman named Margaret. She is 67 years old, and she is what this entire video has been building toward. Not because her life is without difficult people, or demanding relationships, or the occasional guilt that still arrives when she draws a line, but because Margaret has built something inside herself that the guilt can no longer move. She spent 40 years in a marriage that was good in many ways, and demanding in one specific way that she could never quite name until after it ended. Her husband was not a bad man. He was a man who needed a great deal and gave a moderate amount and never noticed the gap because Margaret had spent 40 years filling it without complaint. After he passed 7 years ago, suddenly in a way that gave her no time to prepare, Margaret discovered 2 things simultaneously. The first was grief, real, specific, physical grief for a man she had loved imperfectly and consistently for 4 decades. The second was space, a quality of interior space she had not experienced since before she was married, before the children, before the career and the caregiving and the 40 years of being the person everyone organized their needs around. Space that was hers. And into that space, slowly and with considerable guilt, Margaret began placing things that she wanted. Not dramatically, not with a declaration, with small, specific daily decisions about what she would and would not make available to the people in her life. She told her adult children that Sunday dinners would now be once a month, rather than every week. She told her closest friend that she was no longer available for crisis calls after 9 in the evening. She told her church committee that she was stepping back from 3 of the 4 commitments she had been carrying for years. Every one of these conversations arrived with guilt, and every one of them Margaret sat with, not acting on, not surrendering to, just sitting with until it passed. And it always passed. Seneca wrote, in words that Margaret found in a book her daughter gave her the year after her husband died, "Nusquam est qui ubique est." He who is everywhere is nowhere. Margaret had been everywhere for 40 years. She was learning at 67 what it felt like to be somewhere, specifically, deliberately, fully, somewhere. And Marcus Aurelius, in the line that Margaret has written on a card above her kitchen sink, where she sees it every morning, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." His own soul, not a quieter house, not better behaved children or less demanding friends or a world that suddenly begins to ask less. His own soul, the interior space that becomes available, not automatically, not without work, not without the discomfort of limits drawn and guilt weathered and relationships renegotiated. When you stop filling every available square inch of yourself with other people's needs, Margaret still draws lines, and occasionally the guilt still arrives when she does. But it arrives differently now. Less like a verdict and more like a habit, an old recording that plays and then stops and is no longer the thing that decides. She is the thing that decides. And here is what she would tell Barbara and Gerald and Evelyn and Howard if she could sit across from each of them and say it directly. The guilt does not go away because you argue with it. It goes quiet because you stop obeying it. Every time you draw a line and hold it, through the guilt, through the discomfort, through the relationship finding its new level, you are teaching your own nervous system something it has never been taught. That you are allowed to be here too. That your needs are not negotiable by default. That the people who love you will find a way to adjust to a version of you that takes up its full space, and the people who cannot adjust, who require your diminishment as a condition of the relationship, were never really in a relationship with you. They were in a relationship with your willingness to disappear. Here is the 5th principle. The guilt does not go away because you understand it. It goes quiet because you outlast it. Draw the line. Feel the guilt. Do not act on it. Wait. And on the other side of the waiting, on the other side of the discomfort of a relationship finding its honest level, is something that cannot be given to you by any amount of saying yes. Your own life, fully, finally, unmistakably yours. We started today with a yes you did not mean, and we walked through 5 principles that the Stoics built their lives around, not as philosophy homework, but as the daily, demanding, unglamorous practice of a person who has decided that their own life deserves to be lived on their own terms. The guilt you feel when you draw a line is not evidence the line is wrong. It is evidence the line is new. The guilt you feel when you protect your time is not your conscience. It is a belief you absorbed before you were old enough to examine it. Examine it now. A boundary that requires an essay is still a negotiation. Say the thing once clearly without apology and let the silence do the rest. The people who matter most will not love you less for having limits. They will love the version of you that has them more, because that version is present by choice. And the guilt does not go away because you understand it. It goes quiet because you outlast it. Draw the line, feel the guilt. Do not act on it. Wait. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself by lamplight in words that have survived 2,000 years. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. Stop arguing with the guilt about whether you are allowed to be here. Be here. In the conversation tomorrow where the no is already sitting in your chest before you speak. In the phone call you are dreading because you already know what you're going to say and you already know how it will land. In the quiet Tuesday evening that belongs to you and no one else. Be there. Fully. Without apology. Without the essay. Just there. Take care of your mind. The world will take care of itself. Until next time. If this video gave you the permission you have been waiting for to draw the line, to feel the guilt, and to hold the line anyway, subscribe to this channel. Next week we go deeper into the Stoic principles that help you build a life that is genuinely, completely, and without apology your own. Subscribe now so you never miss what comes next. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, someone who has been saying yes for too long and does not know how to stop, share this video with them. It might be exactly what they have been waiting for someone to say out loud.